In today's episode of the Simulator series, we will be adding commands to our game. As always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, I have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, let's get right into it. So, hopping directly into Studio, the first thing we want to do is install the commands module. I'll leave a link down below in the description to this page, and what you're going to want to do from here is look at the manual section and click on the releases section link. Once you're on here, you're going to want to scroll down to the bottom of the page below where it says contributors and where it says assets, and then you're going to want to download the cmdr.rbxm file. Make sure you save that to somewhere that you'll remember. Now we can go back into Studio and look under our server script service, and we can see we have a libs folder. Now we want to right click on here and go all the way down to where it says insert from file, and now you want to find where you save that file to and select that and then click on open. Now once you've done that, that will insert the module script directly into this folder right here, and you're all good. The module has been installed. Now we have to set the module up on the server side. So what we're going to do is inside of the server script service, we're going to add a brand new folder. We're going to rename this folder to Cmdr, which is short for commander. Then inside of here, we're going to add a script, and we'll also rename this to Cmdr as well. Now we need to get that module. So we'll create a variable for the server script service, and then let's create a variable for the commander module. So local Cmdr equals require server script service.libs.cmdr, and there we go. Now that we have the module, we also want to call a method on this, which is called register default commands. So we're going to say Cmdr and then type out register default commands, and now the default commands that come with commander will be registered. There's one more thing that we have to do for the setup process, and that's actually set this up on the client side. So we want to go into the starter player scripts and add a brand new local script. Now we'll rename this to Cmdr as well, and inside of here we need to create a variable for the replicated storage, and then we also want to create a variable for the commander module as well. Now this module isn't going to be the one that's located inside of the server script service. It's actually going to be located inside of the replicated storage. And if we look inside of replicated storage right now, we obviously don't see that module in here, but once we start our game, the commander module that's inside of our server script service will put whatever it needs to put inside of the replicated storage so that the client can access that as well. So in order to get this, we're going to say replicated storage, wait for child, Cmdr client, because that's going to be the brand new module that's inserted into the replicated storage from the commander module, and this is what it's going to be called, Cmdr client. Now that we have that, we actually have to call a method on this as well, which is going to be called set activation keys. And now this method is actually going to accept a table of key codes. So we'll say table, and then inside of here, we're going to say enum.keycode. And now you can choose any key code that you want to, and we'll just be using F2. So now that we have that all done, we can go ahead and start up our game and see if commander has been set up successfully. When we go into our game, if we click the activation key, which we set to F2, we can now see that this little GUI pops up at the top, meaning commander has been set up successfully. We can also use any of the default commands that are included with this because we registered them. For instance, there is a teleport command, which allows you to select one player and teleport to another player, but obviously we can't teleport to ourselves, so we can't exactly test that out, but we know that commander has been registered successfully, which is good. Now that we have commander set up in our game, we want to start adding some commands. But before we do that, we actually want to create a custom type, which we can use in our own custom commands as well. Now the first command that we're going to be creating is actually going to be called a command called get player data, and that will return to us any of the player's data that we want from the server side. And I put this command in all of my games because it's really nice for debugging, especially when it comes to replicating data from the server down to the client so that you can make sure that the data on the client is also accurate with the data that's on the server. So to add a custom type, we're going to go inside of our commander folder inside of the server script service, and we're going to add a brand new folder to this, which is going to be called types. Now inside of our commander server script, we actually need to create a variable for this types folder. So we're going to say local types folder equals script.parent.types. And now that we have that folder, we actually have to pass that folder to the commander module to register those custom types. So using commander, we can call the register types in method, which is going to accept that types folder, and now every single type that we create and put inside of that folder, commander will register all of those. Then to actually create a specific type, we're going to insert a module script into this types folder, and we're going to rename this module script to the type that we're creating. And the type that we're going to be creating is called data directory. Now I'd recommend that you follow the same casing that I have, so lowercase for the first letter and then uppercase for the first letter of the second word. Now the way that the module scripts are set up to work with commander are a little bit different than what it looks like normally. So what we want to do is delete everything that's currently inside of this module script, and then we want to say return function, which is going to have a parameter called registry. And now inside of this function, we'll actually do something and return the specific type. Before we do that though, we want to create a table with all of the data directories that are actually in our game. Now I should probably explain to you what I mean by data directory. If we look inside of the player data folder, we have this module script called template. This will give us a template of what our basic player data should look like. So if we look inside of the template table, we have a couple of keys, which are of course set to different values. And what I'm referring to by directories is actually the keys. So for instance, clicks, gems, and auto would all be examples of data directories. So what we want to do when we're creating a custom type is we need to actually get each of these individual keys, aka data directories, into their own table so we can create a custom type for Commander. Now to be able to do that, we want to go into our data directory script and create a variable for this template so that we can use this table. Now of course the way to access that table is through the server script server, so we're going to create a variable for that. Then we'll create a variable for the template table. So we're going to say local template equals require server script service.playerData.template. Now that we've got that table, let's create a variable which will just be a table, and that table will hold all of the individual directories. So we're going to say local directories equals just a blank table. Then what we want to do is we want to actually loop through the template. So we'll say for directory, comma, value in template do. So of course when we're looping through the table, the first variable in our for loop is always going to be the key, while the second one is going to be the value of that specific key. Now what we want to do with this is we want to insert each individual directory inside of this directories table. So we're going to say table.insert, now the table that we want to insert them to, which is the directories table, and now what we want to insert into that table, which is the directory. Okay, so now that we've done all of that before we actually get down to the return function right here, that means that this variable should be populated with all of the individual directories. So now inside of the return function, what we want to do is we want to say registry, and we want to call the register type method on this. Now the first argument of this method is the name of the type, and we're going to say data directory. Remember, we want to keep a consistent casing all throughout this, otherwise we could run into errors. So we're going to say lowercase for the first letter. Now the second argument of this method is going to be registry commander.util.make enum type. And now this is actually a method as well, and inside of here we also have to pass through the type and the table as well. So we're going to say data directory, and then for the second argument we're going to pass through the directories table just like that. Now what this method is going to do, it's basically going to return all of the directories to the register type method in a way that Commander is able to register all of them. So now that we've done that, we're pretty much all done with that, but this actually will not work, and we can test that by starting up our game. Now when we start up our game, you should see a similar error to mine, which says player data is not a valid member of server script service, and now if we click on this, we can actually see this is where the error is resulting from. Now something that's really important about this individual error is that where this error is actually being reported from, and that's actually from the client side. So when I first started using Commander, I didn't realize this, but basically all the types that we're creating actually have to be able to be created on the client side as well. So for instance, this script right here is trying to run on the client side, and it's not able to because the client obviously isn't able to access anything that's inside of the server script service. So there's a couple of options or solutions that we could use for this. For example, we could manually type every single directory ourselves, but that wouldn't be too efficient because we'd also have to remember to update them every single time we added a brand new one or deleted one. So what the best solution would be to actually put the template in a place where both the client and the server can access them. Now it's not exactly something that I wanted to do. I didn't exactly want to move this template outside of this player data folder just because it's nice to keep them all organized together, but it is a simple and easy solution to the problem that we're currently having, so I think it's a good idea. So what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, create a brand new folder, and rename this to player data. Then what we'll do is we'll drag the template module script into that folder, and now we have to update this script right here. So instead of going through the server script service to get this, we're going to go through the replicated storage to get this. So there we go, we've updated the variables for that, but we also have to update a variable inside of the data script inside of our player data folder as well. So we can see right here towards the top of our script, we have that template variable. So now rather than getting it from the server script service, we actually want to get it from the replicated storage as well. So we're going to get the replicated storage variable right there, and then get it through the replicated storage just like that. So now that we've updated both of those scripts, we're all good with that. We don't have to worry about anything else being broken, and we actually are all good and done with creating our custom type. Now what we want to do is create a custom command. So what we're going to do is go back inside of the Cmdr folder and create a brand new folder, and this is going to be called commands. Now once again, just like how we did for the types, we also have to create a variable for that commands folder, and now we have the variable, and then we also have to call a method on Commander to register our custom functions as well. So we're going to say Commander register commands in, and then we want to pass through the commands folder. Now that we've done that, we want to go inside of our commands folder and add a brand new module script to this. Now we'll rename this module script to the name of what we want our command to be, so we're going to call this get player data. Once again, their setup of the module script is very different than what we commonly see, so the way that we want to do this is by saying return, and now we're going to create a table. Now inside of this table, we want to create a couple of different properties. The first property we're going to create is name, and we're going to set that to a string, which is going to be the name of our command, and we're going to say get player data. And after the string, we want to make sure that we put semicolon right there. Otherwise, we're going to have an error. The next property that we're going to create is called aliases, and that's going to be equal to a table. And inside of this table, we can basically add different strings for how we could also want the command to be called. So for example, we could just write out get data, and that would also call this command, or we could also write out gpd, which would also run the command as well. And of course, once again, at the end of this table, we want to insert a semicolon just like that. The next property is the description property, which is just a string, and that'll tell the user a little bit of information about the specific command. So we'll say prints the player's data of a specific directory. And there we go. We want to make sure that we add a semicolon after that as well. The next property is group, which is going to be equal to a string. And this is basically a way of filtering out who is able to use the command and who's not. So for instance, if we set this group to admin, then only defined admins in our game are going to be able to use this. And now the final prop that we're going to add is called args, which of course stands for arguments. And that's going to be equal to a table. Now inside of this table, each individual argument is represented by a table as well. So for our first argument, we're going to create a table. And now there's different properties for an argument. So the first property is type, and this will indicate what the specific type of a property is going to be. And we're going to say player, and make sure you do that with a lowercase p, because the first argument needs to be a player. Then the second property is name, which once again is going to be a string, and this will just be the name of the argument. So what is displayed to the player whenever this argument pops up, basically. So we'll say player. We then have the description property, which is once again going to be set to a string. And of course, we can use this to describe the specific property. I'm just going to say the player because it should be pretty self-explanatory. And now the final but not required property that we're going to add to this is called optional, and we're going to set that to true. And make sure you spell optional correctly. Make sure you spell all of these properties correctly, otherwise you're going to run into issues. Now what optional actually does is it basically allows us to type a command, but we don't actually need to type this argument out. And the reason that we don't need to type this argument out is because when we're scripting the functionality of the command, we don't need to be past the specific player because we can get it another way. So now that we're done with that specific argument, we're going to create another argument. And what we're going to do is we're actually just going to copy and paste this table so that we don't have to write out all of these different properties once again, but we will modify these though. So for the second argument, we actually want the data directory, which is the custom type that we just made. So we're going to say data directory. And make sure you spell it the same way. You might even want to just copy and paste it just like that to make sure you don't have any spelling errors. Then we have the name. I'm just going to say data directory. Then we have the description, the directory of data you want to get of a player. And we're also going to set this to optional as well. So now that we have all that, we've basically written out what our command will look like so that Commander can create it. And now we actually have to script the functionality behind it. So what we're going to do is inside of the commands folder, we're going to add a brand new module script to this, and we're going to rename it to the same name of the module script that we just created. So get player data, but we need to add the word server onto the end of this because that's the way the Commander will tell that this is the specific module script for the functionality of that command. Now, of course, once again, the way that this module script is going to be set up is different than most module scripts. So we're going to delete everything inside of here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say return function. And now for the parameters, the first parameter is always going to be context. Now the second parameter is going to be dependent upon how you created the command. So for instance, right here, the second argument would be player and the third argument would be data directory. So we're going to say player, and that's going to be equal to the type of player, and then data directory, and we're just going to say that that's equal to a string, and now we have our function created. Now additionally, we can modify the types of our specific parameters because remember, we made both of these arguments optional. So what we're going to do is put a question mark right there and put a question mark right there, so that'll indicate that both of those are optional. Now setting the type and the optionals don't actually matter right here, but this is good to do so that we can see this and understand that this is how it actually is set up. Anyways, the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is we want to make sure that we set the player argument. So we're going to say player equals if player then player, else context.executor. So we're going to set the player variable, and now if there's already a player, then we're just going to set it to the same player. So the variable is literally going to stay the same if it's already valid. But if it's not valid because there's no player passed to it, then we're going to set the player is equal to the context.executor. And now what context.executor is the person who actually executed this command. So whoever typed out this command is going to be set to the player if they didn't pass a specific player to the command. Next, what we want to do is we want to actually get the player's profile. And how do we do that? Well, we need to get the server script service. Now that we have the server script service, we got to get the player data module. So we're going to say local player data equals require server script service dot player data dot manager. And now back inside of our function, we can create a variable for the player's profile. So we're going to say local profile equals player data dot profiles and index that with the player. And now if we're not able to find the profile, so if not profile, then what we want to do is return no profile found. Question mark. Now, each time that you return something inside of this specific function, whatever you return will actually be displayed to the player who executed this command. So we could just return and we don't have to include any text, which is usually what I do when I'm developing my own games. But the best practice would be to give a message so that the player understood, oh, this is where an error happened in the command basically, so that's why we're not getting any data back. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to check if the data directory exists. So if not data directory, because remember, we made that optional. So then what we want to do is we actually want to print all of the player's data. So we're going to say print profile.data, and then we're going to return all data printed, exclamation mark. So if we don't pass through any data directory, then what we're going to do is we're going to print the player's data, and then we're going to stop the script here and tell that player who executed the command all the data has been printed. But finally, if there is a data directory, what we want to do is we want to print profile.data and index that with the data directory. And then finally, we want to return data printed, exclamation mark. Okay, so if we're not able to find any profile, then we're just going to return no profile found. If we're not past any data directory, then we're going to print all of the player's data, and then we'll tell them that we printed all of their data. And if there is a data directory specified, then we will print that specific data, and we'll say data printed, just like that. So now we should be able to start up our game and test this command out. So we've now loaded into the game. We can hit F2 to pop up the commander terminal, and now we can type out our command. So get player data, just like that. And now remember, we made all of the arguments optional. So if we just hit enter, we should see that all of our data has been printed, and we can see the message that we've returned to this function, so all data printed. And then we can also see that there's a table inside of our output, and if we open this table, we can see all of our data has actually been printed. So we can go through each of the individual tables inside of here and see all of their data, and then we can also see all the data right here as well. Now you might be thinking, well, is this inaccurate because the leader stats actually has one click and it's also displayed right there as well? That's actually just because I earned the click after calling this function. So if we wanted to, we could literally just call that command again, and now we can see that when we open up this table, we now have one click. So that's working, which is good. But now let's try to pass through a couple of arguments. So we're going to pass through the player, and then let's say clicks as the directory because we want to know the specific amount of clicks that the player has, and we can see data printed, and we can also see in our output 1 because we only have one click. Now if there were other players in our server, we could put their name here instead of our own name, and we could check their individual data as well, but we're the only one in the server right now, so we obviously can't do that. Now there's actually one more thing we need to do before we can use our commands in a live game. If we look at the commander terminal, we can actually see a message that's output by the commander after we use our first command, and that says server commands will not run in-game if no before run hook is configured, learn more, and then it gives us a link. Now what this actually means is that if we go into a normal game, so outside of studio, our commands will not be able to be ran by anybody until we configure this specific thing. So let's go ahead and actually create a hook so that we can start running commands in our live games. The first thing we want to do is go into the server script service, into the commander folder, and add a brand new folder, and we're going to rename this from folder to hooks. Now that we have that, we of course want to make a variable for this inside of the Cmdr script. So we're going to say hooks folder, and that's going to be equal to script.parent.hooks, and now we also have to say register hooks in, just like all of our other commands, and then also specify the hooks folder. So once this method is called, all the hooks inside of this folder will be registered. The next thing we want to do is go inside of the hooks folder and add a brand new module script to this. Now the name of this module script doesn't really matter. I'm just going to name it primary because it's our primary hook, which will run before every single command. And as usual, this module script is going to be set up different than normal. So we're going to say return function, and now the argument of this function is going to be registry. So to get this to work, we actually need to use registry and then call a method on this, which is called register hook. Now the first argument of this method is actually going to be a string, and it's going to be one of two different strings, either before run or after run. And we're going to set this to before run because we want our hook to actually run before the command runs so that we can basically set up permissions for who's allowed to use specific commands. Now this method also has a second argument, and that's actually going to be a function with the argument context. Now if you forgot about context at all, we also use context when we're scripting the functionality of our command. So with the context, we can actually access who is executing this specific command. So we can say if context.executor, and now we actually have the player who is executing this command. So we can say .user ID, and now we want to say if the executor's user ID does not equal our own ID, then what we want to do is return, and we're going to return a message, and the string that we're going to return is basically going to be the denial message telling the player who's trying to execute this command, hey, you don't have permissions to execute this command. Also, if you don't know how to get your own user ID, just start your game, go into the player service inside of the Explorer, click on your player, and then you can see your user ID right in the properties panel right here. So the string that we're going to return, we can just say you don't have permission to use this command, exclamation mark, just like that. So now we can go ahead and start up our game and test out our commands. So if we open up Commander, we can say get player data, hit enter, and now we see that message is actually no longer displayed to us. And we were able to use the command, which is perfect. Let's do another test though, and I'm actually going to alter this user ID so it doesn't match mine anymore, and then we'll also test this out once again. So now when we start up our game and try to use the get player data command, it actually says you don't have permission to use this command. So we've successfully created the hook, and this will basically act as the permission system for who's allowed to use specific commands and who's not. Also, if you remember when we actually created this command or configured it to Commander's liking, one of the properties of the command is called group, and we can actually incorporate the group to our permission system. So we can say if context.group equals admin and the player's user ID does not equal the admin's user ID, then we are going to say you don't have permission to use this command. So if a command's group is set to admin, then they will also need to have the same user ID, otherwise they're going to have an error. But for all other commands which don't share the admin group, the user ID will not be checked here. So every command which is not in the admin group will be able to be used by any player. Also, make sure that you spell the word group correctly, otherwise that won't work. With all that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. You should now have a working command system in your game, and you should understand how to easily implement and add your own commands and custom types. As always, if you guys did enjoy the video or it did help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, with Patreon, if you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode, there's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.